Okay, who is Confucius and what is his philosophy? We're going to see if this video format here will work. Um, we're talking today about a very important, probably the most important Chinese philosopher who shaped not just philosophy, but really all of Chinese culture. Sort of like in the West, Socrates had a huge influence on how we even um, how we think in general. Confucius really defined not just Chinese thinking, but also all of Eastern Asia, because the influence of Confucian ideas um, moved over into Korea, into Japan, down into Vietnam. And so it's a very powerful and strong cultural force. So his Confucius, we know his name is Confucius in the West. His actual name is Kongzi, and sometimes this was basically said, given an honorific title of Confuci, which basically was then transliterated as Confucius. And his dates are 551 to 479 BCE. And this is an important time period because this is sometimes considered, right in the center of the what's called the axial age of religions. And it is interesting that during this time frame, you also have in India a contemporary of Kongzi, and that is the Buddha, whose name was Gautama Siddhartha, and we now call him the Buddha. But he's born approximately in 563, so there's a kind of overlap in Asian philosophy of Confucius in the Far East and the Buddha in India, and these end up being incredibly huge cultural forces in all of Asia. And it's interesting that they're basically developing their philosophies about the same time. So today we want to focus on Confucius and see what are his sort of major contributions, what are his ideas, and how do they contrast with other ways of doing philosophy and other philosophical ideas. His main work is the one that is familiar to most, and this is called the Analects. It's a collection of his writings, and we're not sure how much of this was written by him directly. I think the general sort of latest scholarship suggests that he's probably responsible for the first 10 chapters or so, and then we think that subsequent Confucian scholars contributed the second half of the book. It's a pretty small book. It can be read almost in its entirety, with some ease. It's not like the Buddhist scriptures, which just are just a huge. The Pali Tripitaka is a gigantic set of scriptures generated over hundreds of years. And this is different. This is a short little collection of sayings by the master, Confucius, and they're quite pithy, and some of them are just obvious on the face of it what they mean, and others require some careful unpacking. And also, we want to look at perhaps some of the early aphoristic sections of the Analects in this discussion, and we'll need a little bit of Chinese vocabulary to make sense out of some of the technical terms, but it's fairly straightforward. All right, so let me make some preparatory comments about China and Chinese history, and then go on to talk about Confucius in particular. Confucius is generally living during what's called the Warring States period in Chinese history. And this is a period that runs from 481 to 221 BCE. And this is, as you might imagine, a very volatile period of political and cultural unrest. There's a lot of warring going on between um, factions, warlords. China is not, during this period, during the 5th and 6th century BCE, it is not like how we understand it today. It's not a unified country. It's a set of much smaller, what are almost like nation states within the larger, what we recognize as the Middle Kingdom, Zhongguo. Um, and there's a lot of violence, and you have basically agricultural society paying tributes to different warlords, and then these warlords basically fighting each other for territory and for resources. And of course, Chinese culture is much older than this. In China, you will frequently hear Chinese people saying that Chinese culture is 5,000 years old. And this is, it's hard to say whether this is accurate because we have a few, sort of the earliest periods, a few thousand years. We really have more as references and hearsay in much later documents. The earliest I think we have of culture is the kind of oracle bone culture that we have. And this is from like 2025, this would be like 2000 BCE. So about 4,000 years, and maybe closer to 1000 BC to be more accurate. And these are the bones of animals, sort of usually this sort of like I don't know what it's called exactly. Is it a scapula? It's sort of the back. It's like a sort of a wide bone in your back right here. And these taken from oxen were oftentimes read by shaman and holy men who were sort of mystics. They would sacrifice an animal, and just like the Greeks, who sort of had a tradition of augury, where you would sacrifice the animal and you would cut open the liver or some internal organ, and then some priest or priestess would study the organ and see whether or not your future military campaign would be of success or not. So too in China, you had a similar kind of augury tradition where the priest would look at these oracle bones and try to decide, based on little cracks in them, what the future would hold. Sort of, the phrase "reading the tea leaves," also a kind of Chinese tradition. This is an even earlier phase of reading the oracle bones, and these were also oftentimes written on then by a kind of primitive Hanzi, or a very primitive kind of Chinese writing, a pictorial form of writing. Much later, we got the kind of writing system that we're more familiar with, and by the time Confucius is writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, he's already looking back at what he considers to be a kind of golden era, which he calls the Western Zhou period. And the Zhou period is oftentimes kind of considered to be the Zhou dynasty is sometimes considered to be a mythical golden era, where the rulers were all geniuses and highly virtuous, and the people were all, devoted and upright. And by the time Confucius is writing, during the beginning of the Warring States period, he's basically trying to look back at this period and say, wouldn't it be great to go back and for Chinese people and Chinese culture to have this kind of refined, ethical culture that we had in the Western Zhou period, like 700 years ago from the time of Confucius. And this is not that different from in Greece when, during Plato's era, well, sort of a little later, during the Hellenistic period, there's a lot of looking back to the Homeric time, the time of the epic poems. and sort of treating that as the golden era. And wouldn't it be great to get that kind of level of virtue and ethics and uprightness back again? So this is a very similar sort of cultural Renaissance period in China, and it's got a kind of romantic view of the past. But it shows you something important, which is that Confucianism is going to be what we call conservative. And by this, don't confuse this with sort of American politics. I mean, there's some overlap here. What it means is you're trying to conserve traditions. The belief for Confucius, and you see this in the Analects, is that there's great wisdom contained within traditional culture. And all we have to do is go back to those traditions, relearn them, master them, live according to them, and we will be better people. We'll all be better off. So, all right, that's the kind of cultural context. Let me say a couple of maybe comments that are. It's really sort of a. This is sort of a combination of, philosophical and anthropological sort of preparatory comments. During this period, you have a change during this axial age period, and it actually is it's a problem or a challenge for early civilization. And it goes back really to what anthropologists will call the Holocene period. So if you think about human evolution, you'll remember, if you can sort of cast your mind back, that before we had sort of civilizations that we recognize, whether they're Chinese or whether they're Egyptian or Persian, we had a kind of long prehistory that was essentially dominated by a hunter-gatherer approach to life. So our ancestors, whether they were, Homo sapiens, who evolved out of Africa and moved into Europe and then into the rest of the world around 50,000 years ago, or even some of the sort of pre-human hominids like sort of Homo erectus, or even some of our contemporaries in Europe like Neanderthals, we were all hunter-gatherers. We had a division of labor where usually males, men hunted, and usually females were foragers, closer to home, usually digging up the food that really saved us. It wasn't meat hunting that saved us. It was basically like underground food storages like potatoes, tubers, root vegetables, and so forth. This is how we survived primarily. So we had this kind of hunter-gatherer system, division of labor, and the way in which we survived were in very small groups. I think most human beings lived in groups that were around, 30 to 150 people. And for the most part, we cooperated with each other, but it was relatively easy because most of these people a fair share of these people were your family, extended family. You actually had blood relations who you dealt with. Obviously, siblings, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, nephews, and then, so you would have several families, extended families all linked together and working as a hunter-gatherer group. Now, cooperation in those kinds of groups is not that mysterious because all mammals really, including us, will make sacrifices or act altruistically for the sake of their children, for the sake of their cousins. I will make sacrifices for my own by sharing food with relations. And so cooperation between kin, blood relations, is not particularly mysterious. All animals do it. There's probably, there's a Darwinian logic underneath this, which has to do with genetic, sustaining, your genetic line. But when you get to the development of agriculture, say 10,000 years ago, and then the kind of civilizations that start to arise and show up in the record about 5,000 years ago, Now you've got a different social dynamic. Now families are basically a social organization is growing exponentially from these small family groups to very large societies. And here you have really giant, uh, the start of cities, urban spaces where many, many people live together and they're not related to each other. They're not family members. Um, and this causes what many anthropologists will call the cooperation challenge or the cooperation problem. Why do large numbers of people living in urban spaces cooperate with each other? They're not related to each other, and there's a high degree of anonymity, so you can kind of get away with not cooperating. You can get away with crimes. You can be what's called a freeloader or a free rider. Just take advantage of food and resources, but not give back to the community because these large urban spaces allow you to sort of drift into anonymity and back in again. And so it's a very different kind of social world to have to navigate. And so for philosophers, this is interesting because it's the rise of what we would think of as kind of large scale morality systems. Why would we cooperate and help each other if we're not blood relations or kin? We're strangers essentially. So you know, um, why would I give you respect? Why would I sort of not steal your stuff if I was bigger and stronger? Um, and this is sort of the rise then, as I mentioned earlier, of the axial age religions. So Judaism forms, during this time period. Hinduism forms during this time period. As I was saying, Buddhism a little later, and Confucianism, Christianity, obviously, the youngest, of course, is Islam. But all of these religions have a kind of similar project, which is how can strangers treat each other with respect and create a world of ethical achievement. And as I said, this was relatively new in terms of human evolution. So Confucius falls right into this challenge. And at this time, there's kind of two ways to do this, and you see this in many other traditions too. Since you evolved to kind of take care of your family, then you're going to have tribal instincts. There just seem to be natural properties of not just human instinct, but mammal instinct. You share resources with your offspring, but not with non-kin, not with strangers. So the question is, how do you get that kind of, let's call that a kind of family altruism. You're not acting selfishly, you're acting selflessly for your family. How can you get that expanded out to larger social groups? Because on its own, it's a very tight circle of concern. It's just your family. Now, if you look at philosophies or religions like Christianity, you can see that one of the major projects is to try to get this circle of concern to be larger and larger and larger, so that you're treating you're not just treating your brother and your sister and your parents with respect. Christianity and Buddhism is a very good example of this too. They're teaching you to think of these people, these strangers in the city with you or in the village with you, as also your brethren. These are also your brothers and sisters. This is why even the scriptures of Buddhism and of Christianity use the language of, oh, that person is my brother. We're brothers in Christ, or we are brothers in the Dharma. And this is a way of getting us to, it's called fictive kin. You're not really related by blood, but you are forming a group of us, and this group also means you're going to share resources with them, food. You're going to it was very common in the early periods of these religions for you to feel like you could go into another city and you could find a place to stay and a meal and a bed to sleep on. So being a Christian or being a Buddhist also meant a kind of group solidarity. And so Confucius comes along, and at this time, there's sort of two major ways to solve this problem. One is you create laws that basically have very strong punishments. So I'm going to cooperate because the law says I need to not go in and take your stuff when I want your food and your goods, and you're not going to come in and take my stuff, because if you do, then the law will come and punish you severely. So you still want to take my stuff, I still want to take your stuff, but the law is a kind of external overlay of ethics and forces us to be good people because we're afraid of punishment, or we want the rewards that the law might provide or protect. So this is a view of ethics which is what we would call legalistic. And sure enough, in Chinese culture, there is a school of philosophy called legalism, or the legalists. And this is the idea that human nature can't really be changed. It's going to be selfish. So you need some very strict laws and some very severe punishments in order to get people to check their own selfishness. Now, Confucius doesn't really like this idea, and he offers the alternative view, which is he thinks that you can, in a sense, retrain yourself so that your selfish impulses become sort of put through a kind of cultural education so that they become like a better version of the original instincts that you have. So you have sort of human nature, and then you get this kind of cultural education, and that's what gives you sort of human nature 2.0. It gives you a second nature, which is a new set of instincts which are more charitable, more altruistic, more selfless. You have more compassion for others. You help others more. You become more ethically upright. So Confucius takes the view that ethics and cooperation, sort of at the small scale level and at the large scale level of the society, comes from this kind of careful cultural education. And he's going to try to explain how to do it and how we could all sort of live in a better society. So that's the project. It's simultaneously a kind of political philosophy, but also he's going to argue that that political philosophy comes out of a psychology. That there's a kind of human psychology that can be perfected or developed through education, and that's what will basically trickle up as and influence the sort of larger social political experience. All right, so I think that's the main stuff we need to do, sort of scene setting. I'm going to let's start by looking at some simple passages here right from the beginning of the Confucian Analects. Excuse me. The Confucian Analects emerge. Maybe one or two more words about who he is, Confucius. We don't know that much about him. We do know that he desperately wanted political office, and it's not that he wanted power per se, but he wanted to have a high-ranking status within the state so that he could be an advisor to emperors and chiefs and sort of those who wielded power, because he thought that his philosophy could really have a transformative role on the state. He never quite got the kind of position he wanted in government, and so you can kind of hear some of this in his writings, and we know this from external sources. And he contrasts in a way with a contemporary, roughly contemporary of his, which is an alternative philosophy to Confucius called Taoism. And this is something that many of you will have heard of, the Tao. The Tao is a Chinese word which means way I'm just using pinyin here. My Hanzi is not good enough to give you the Chinese character, so I'm just going to give you pinyin. And if you look at this word, you see this frequently within the sort of more mystical tradition of Chinese philosophy, Taoism. And there's a bunch of books out on this, on sort of westernizing or a Western appreciation of Taoism. And it's a philosophy, it literally just means the way, but it's used by different philosophers to mean different things. Confucius uses it to describe um, finding the way of culture that makes you, a higher level human being, as I was just discussing. Whereas the Taoists use it to mean the way is the way of nature, not the way of culture. Taoists think that what you need to do is figure out how nature works, what its sort of intrinsic properties are, and then make your own life consistent and, in a sense, in harmony with nature, because that will make you and society much better off. So this is a sort of different use of the same Chinese word Tao. All right, so let's look then at the very first. So I'm using this, it's a pretty nice translation. Right now I don't see the translator's name on this, but I'll try to find it. And let's look at just the very first stanza from Book 1. Here, it's a very short little saying. It says, "The master said," and Confucius, or Confucius is referred to as the master here. So the master said, "To study and at due times practice what one has studied, is this not a pleasure? When friends come from distant places, is this not joy? To remain unsoured when his talents are unrecognized, is this not a junzi?" Okay, what is a junzi? So let me introduce this Chinese word to you. It is, it's oftentimes translated to mean gentleman, but I think this is kind of a bad translation. I'm going to put it here for you, but I want the caveat, the junzi. You see, it really means, first of all, it really, ultimately, its meaning is not gender exclusive. It includes women, but it means the truly refined human being, someone who has attained the highest levels of culture. And we don't really have a word for this, I think, in the West. That's why people use gentleman, because it kind of fits, but oftentimes gentleman means, you just have good manners. And this is something way deeper than that. You do have good manners, but you've cultivated an inner sense of virtue too. So this is the highest level. So I might just use this word junzi and don't translate it, but I think you can understand what I mean from this little sketch. And so he says, look, isn't this the sign of the junzi? Somebody who essentially enjoys those things that he mentioned, namely to practice what you've studied. To study is a kind of property of the junzi, or the highest human being. To enjoy friends when they come from distant places. And then also, this is kind of a fun one, he says, to remain unsoured when your talents go unrecognized. And this is sort of him. He felt like he was never quite appreciated, never quite recognized in the way that he should have. But if you can bear that with a smile and with grace, it shows that you're a cultivated person. And I think this is true that for us too today. We desperately want to be acknowledged. We want to be relevant. We want to be somebody. In fact, our whole culture is sort of pointing us towards this. But at some point, you sometimes meet these people who are unrecognized in the official culture. They don't have a famous, they're not celebrities. Nobody knows them except their families. And yet they have a certain style and grace about them. They're comfortable in their skin. They're not trying to get your approval. This is what he's driving at. If you're like a celebrity seeker, and a lot of us are, particularly in American society, then he thinks you're sort of craving the recognition and accolades of others, and then you're dependent on them for recognition. Whereas if you are sort of at home in your own life without the need of recognition or praise by others, then it's a sign that you've achieved a kind of level of wisdom, the Junzi. Um, so I think this is just a nice way of getting at, like, we're already getting really the core ideas of Confucianism. It's hard to sort of make this sound sexy and like deep and interesting, like existentialism sounds, or like even like Buddhism sounds, which is kind of weird and expects you to alter your consciousness through meditation. There's something deeply um, conventional about Confucianism, and it's why I think younger people aren't drawn to it, but maybe older people recognize something in it of wisdom, because it's the simple pleasures and the simpler cultivations that he thinks will lead to the big revolutions. He doesn't want you to go to a cave and meditate your whole life. In fact, there's a wonderful passage. I don't have it ready to hand, but it's in the Analects, where Confucius says, he says, "Oh yeah, I one time spent all day meditating, you know." Um, and he says it was kind of useless, worthless. I would have rather spent all that time, study in the library, essentially studying books and learning information. That's the way to develop yourself, not these kind of esoteric bohemian philosophies. Confucianism really has a kind of bourgeois philosophy. Study if you want to be smart. Um, Practice what you've studied. Enjoy your friends who come from afar. Drink some tea together. That's the recipe for happiness. You don't have to climb to the top of the mountain and sacrifice your family on the search for enlightenment. This is a very un-Confucian idea, and Confucianism is kind of hostile to this idea. So here's some. In fact, here is the very next stanza. We're in Book 1, paragraph 2, and Confucius says, "It is rare." Master Yo said, "It is rare to find a person who is filial to his parents and respectful of his elders, yet who likes to oppose his ruling superior. And never has there been one who does not like opposing his ruler, but who has raised a rebellion. The Junzi works on the root. Once the root is planted, the Tao is born. Filiality and respect for elders, are these not the roots of Zhen?" So, okay, we've got some terms here. He says, right away, he's using some terms we just introduced. He says, if you want to be a Junzi and achieve the Tao, you must have what he calls filial piety, or this is a word, we don't use this word very often, but it means family respect, family ethics. Filial refers to family. And in particular in China, it's respect for parents or elders. So he says, if you want to be a good person and be the highest kind of person, then you must have respect for your parents, respect for your elders. This is the way of the Junzi, and it is the way of the Tao. And this kind of a person is also a very good citizen, because, as you heard him say there, this is the kind of person that would never rebel against a good ruler. He would respect the good ruler, almost like a father figure. And this is very Chinese, traditionally Chinese. This word filial here, piety, is the Chinese for it is xiao. And xiao, right here, is still a very important word in Chinese culture. It's the key. That's why he's calling it in this passage the root. Once you have the root, then what flows from the root, the plant, and then the fruits will all be healthy and good if the roots are good. So if you want to have a good human being, then you develop the roots of that human being in terms of character, and that will then good behavior will flow from those roots. It's interesting that this idea is very ancient in Chinese culture. Um, Confucius sees it as part of this, Western Zhou period, but also he really codifies this as a ethical framework for Chinese culture. And I recently saw a film, very famous film now. It got a lot of attention and made a lot of money. I think it's called Crazy Rich Asians, and it's based on best-selling novel. I think it's maybe even a series of novels. And I mean, it's no great. It's not Citizen Kane or anything, but it's got some charming qualities to it. And one of the things about that film, if you've seen the film or if you see the film, you'll recognize that Shao, or family duty, is a huge and important part of the storyline. And it's contrasted in a way with Western um, ideals or goals. So there's a classic tension between somebody who grows up in a Chinese family and who then maybe moves to America or the West. And in the West, the emphasis is placed on the individual and the fulfillment of the individual and the happiness of the individual. And this is actually in contrast with Chinese culture, which is not really worried about you as an individual. You are, in a sense, secondary to the well-being of the family. So your duty and obligation to the family comes first if you're from China, if you're Confucian. And this is in contest, oftentimes, with your own goals and dreams and aspirations. So there's a tension between East and West on this question. And if we live in a very globalized world nowadays, where there's a lot of people who go between Western culture and Eastern culture. My own son is half Chinese, so we spend some of the time in China and we spend some of the time in the United States, and he's a mixture. We're a mixture in a way of these Eastern traditions where the family is everything and you as an individual are secondary, versus the Western paradigm, which is you are the most important person and you should be following your own dreams. Follow your bliss no matter what. This is the kind of Western dream fulfillment. So in this film, Crazy Rich Asians, you see this tension played out in the characters. And it's fun for that reason alone, in addition to other kind of amusing features. All right, so we're getting into it. We're getting there. We've got some major concepts, terminology, and some basic ideas about how ethics forms. The third, let's look at, again, we're at Analect's book 1, and let's look at the third paragraph, very short. It just says, the master said, those of crafty words and ingratiating expression are rarely zhen. Now, here's this other term we need to introduce. We're almost done with the terms we need, so don't despair. This is a really important word, too, in Chinese philosophy. And in pinyin, it is zhen. You basically say zhen. Can't remember which tone it is right now. I should have looked it up. Zhen means it translates as human being. It could just be a person that you're designating, a human being, a member of a zoological group, a Homo sapiens. But it also, in this sense, means, in the Confucian sense, means the highest kind of person. Again, the Junzi is the person who's achieved this. But the idea of humanity being perfected is this idea of zhen. And you have the highest level of humanity when you are a Junzi. So that means the Junzi has achieved zhen. And this is a word that's oftentimes used in Confucian ideas, and it means that you, with training, could be one of these kind of moral heroes. Your character could become so good that you're the highest kind of human being. I mean, we recognize this kind of stuff too. We talk about moral paragons all the time. We talk about Martin Luther King as being a moral paragon. You could say he has zhen. He is a Junzi. We say this about Mother Teresa. We might say this about Gandhi. They've attained like a level of human character that we consider to be really outsized. I mean, really just impressive, impressive. So here he's saying, if you're just using crafty words and basically sucking up to people using ingratiating expressions, you're obsequious. You're just kissing ass, we would say. Then you're never going to achieve Zhen. You're never going to be one of these truly great people. You're just going to be out for yourself, trying to tell people what they want to hear. That's not what you want to do in Confucianism. Um, and then Analects 1.4, the fourth paragraph, Master Zheng said, each day I examine myself upon 3 points. In planning for others, have I been loyal? So loyalty is a very big issue in Confucianism. I would say it's like the prime virtue. In the company of friends, have I been trustworthy? So can my friends trust me? Notice actually this says in the company of my friends, am I trustworthy? It doesn't say, am I trustworthy for everyone? That's kind of an important point. There's sort of a slightly different ethic. This is not an ethics for strangers. It's more of an ethics for friends first, strangers second. And then finally, have I practiced what has been passed on to me? In other words, he's saying, has my learning or study actually made me, am I practicing what I learned? Am I doing the rites and rituals of society that improve other people? So this is an important, 2 other important words. In Chinese culture, the word for rituals is li, L-I in pinyin. And li is like a set of rituals or activities that you would do. You might think of these as religious, and they did too, but they can also mean just sort of everyday rituals of hospitality. When it can go all the way from like large-scale sacrifices of animals and songs at religious ceremonies, all the way to simple stuff like, what do you do when somebody visits you? What kind of hospitality is extended to them? Do you make them some food? Do you sit down and ask them about themselves before you go on to things like business? So these micro rituals too are very important in Confucianism. They're crucial. And if you engage in this stuff, then you end up being a better human being. Now, how do you attain and understand the rules and the rituals? You basically you must engage in shui. Shui means study here. So shui is a word that it can just mean like xiaoshui, which means like a little school, like or zhongshui means middle school, or dashui means university. So it can just mean like school, but it has a much more generic and philosophical meaning, which is the study of the classics, the classic texts, the study of these rituals, the study of great people's lives. Understanding great people is a kind of study, and the study of philosophy. These things, and also the study of crafts. Like, have you studied calligraphy? How's your calligraphy writing? Have you studied martial arts? These are forms of study that are not just. It's not just that you acquire a skill; you actually become a better human being by these kinds of study too. So, shui and study is extremely important in Chinese culture. This is why Chinese culture is, they have a different view towards learning than you have in American culture. So American culture has a strange kind of, it's not even ambivalence. There's a kind of hostility. The American psyche was built on a sort of frontier mindset, which is, forget tradition. I need to go out west and forge, my way, till the land, have a farm, have a family. It's the sort of frontier mindset that was able to expand out into the entire, North American continent and subdue the land and make money or make a living. And it had a sort of tense relationship with the intellectual traditions of old Europe. And so you see this in the writings of people like Emerson and Thoreau. What mattered mostly was experience, not going back and reading all the right books. We are pragmatists. That's the only philosophical school that America ever generated, is pragmatism. And so there's a bit of a anti-intellectualism in American culture. And this is very different from Chinese culture, where if you are a teacher, at least historically, it's a little different now because of the incredible explosion of Chinese wealth over the last 10 years or so. But in traditional Chinese culture, if you were a teacher, Laoshi, you are treated with great respect, and it's considered a great honor to have teachers, professors come to your home. If you have a PhD, you're considered to be somebody special, and the students treat you with respect. The community treats you with respect. The fact that you're not making a lot of money is not an issue so much in traditional Chinese culture. It's that you are a very learned person. You've taken the trouble to develop yourself and pursue and understand things like poetry and philosophy and music. And these are generally considered to be these, important features of character. So there is a sense in which Chinese culture today, this is why Chinese people do really well in school, and when they immigrate to another country, they master the tests, they master the knowledge, they excel in formal education. There is a very strong emphasis on education in Chinese culture, and I'm showing you in a sense where it comes from. This is where it comes from in terms of Confucian ideas. All right, here's another short passage. Here we are in book 1. This is all on the very first page of the Analects, and I'm just trying to unpack all of the big ideas that just get reiterated and reinforced in all the later paragraphs. Here we are in 1.6. So this is book 1, paragraph 6. The master said, a young man should be filial. So remember, filial means sort of having family duty or respect. Should be filial within his home and respectful of elders when outside. He or she should be careful and trustworthy, broadly caring of people at large, and should cleave to those who are zhen, who have humanity. If he has energy left over, he may study the refinements of culture, zhen. Wen. So this is a different word, very important. Wen means culture, and it's sort of what we would describe as sort of the liberal arts. As I was saying, it usually means poetry, literature, music, philosophy. These are incredibly important. And first, you want to be good to people and treat them right and have behaviors of hospitality and so forth. And then you want to study. And these two things together reinforce each other and create, the highest kind of junzi. All right, those are some of the big ideas in Confucianism. I want to jump to a couple of other places and pick up a couple of other big ideas, just so we have a fuller picture of Confucianism. Maybe 2 more words that are philosophically important within Chinese philosophy. One is this word we've been using, which is virtue. But I think this is kind of a troublesome interpretation of this as well. The word is de, and de translates as virtue, but virtue has these weird kind of Victorian connotations, like patience is a virtue, silence is a virtue. That's not quite what's meant here. There's something deeper being implied here, which is virtue is a kind of behavior that's ethically good, but also it's a kind of power that you have. If you have virtue, you have a kind of I I hesitate to say that you have a metaphysical power, but it is like having a kind of a superpower. And the belief is that once you attain by study and by good behaviors and so forth, then people can see that you have it. It's like having I'm trying I guess maybe an analogy would be like having the force. If you're a Star Wars fan, you're thinking of the force, and if you train and train, then you can activate the force within you. And people who are sensitive can see that you have the force. And in a way, this really does make sense because these ideas that come out of Star Wars are from uh, Eastern philosophy. They're either drawn from Confucianism, like we're talking now, or from Taoism, which was, as I was saying before, is the sort of contemporary of Kongzi. Lao Tzu is sort of the main proponent or philosopher of Taoism. And so here the idea in Confucianism is if you train well to be a good person, you have a kind of energy, as it were, that can be seen by others, and it gets you respect, and then you use it to help other people. So it's not good for self-aggrandizing. It is good because it makes you a magnanimous and a good person. You are helping others all the time, and you're a kind of hero in the community. So virtue has all of these qualities to it. Um, I think, one other word sort of like this that's very important to Asian philosophy is wu wei. And here, the translation again is a little tricky. It's sometimes translated as this is the word wu wei, and sometimes it's translated as non-action. But it really should mean action in accordance with nature. And so this is what I was getting at before. Like in life, there's a way to do things, action in accordance with nature. There's a way of doing things that is in harmony with nature, and a way of doing things that is unnatural, that's purely artificial, that's trying to force things. And the idea in Chinese philosophy is try to find the way things naturally flow and basically organize your own life in this way. So you look at how a river flows. It doesn't, sort of move at right angles. It has a certain kind of gentle flow, and yet the way water sort of moves across a rock can seem almost insignificant, and the rock seems stronger. But over hundreds of years, what happens is the water can carve, the Grand Canyon. This is the river, basically the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon. So what looks gentle and simple and unpowerful turns out to actually be the most powerful. And the Taoist and the Confucian sort of sage wants to figure this out and work with it. Now, there's something different about Confucian philosophy, which is nature only takes you so far. Then culture has to take you the rest of the way. So Confucian sages believe that you must get better and better at language and philosophy and poetry in order to perfect yourself. And in this sense, it's very pro-culture. You don't come out of the womb like some Rousseau sort of perfectible creature that just has to live according to its natural instincts. Culture has to take your pre-prepared cultural, capacities, and those capacities must be activated by art and music and paintings, and these things refine you. And it's in this cultural refinement that you become a real human being. Here again, I think the American ethos is sort of against is hard to sort of understand this because we live in a very informal culture where we sort of believe in the let it all hang out, be yourself, be your, whereas the Chinese would say, like, Confucians would say, no, don't let it all hang out. Don't just give in to your initial instincts. Train those instincts to be better than they are at the beginning. So poetry does this, the other cultural features of Wen. And so these are also important features. All right, so let's look then quickly at a couple of other passages. One here is Book 2, 2.1. It says, the master said, when one rules by means of virtue, so here this word again, it is like the North Star. It dwells in its place, and the other stars pay reverence to it. So this is, if you became a very virtuous person, people would seek you out, and they would essentially like try to work around you, like work with you in a sense. You would become a great inspiration. People could navigate, just like sailors would use the North Star to navigate. People could navigate their lives by looking at the way you live your life. And this was designed to sort of apply to you and me, but also he's thinking about the ruler. So you want somebody that, is so virtuous in their activity that they inspire you to be a better person and to follow the law. I guess there's a great contrast here with somebody like Donald Trump. Even if you like Donald Trump's policies, I think that generally people agree that he lacks a certain kind of cultivated refinement in the way he communicates, in the way he talks, in the way he thinks. Like, it's very common for him to, even if somebody makes some slight insult to him, he'll spend time, presumably time and energy, away from other things, addressing that insult and responding to it and making sure that he sort of wins that little debate. The Confucian scholar, or the Confucian sage, is too big, too magnanimous to be worried about the little petty criticisms by somebody on Twitter. There's a wonderful Chinese idiom. I'm trying to remember it in Chinese, and I can't. I can't remember it in Chinese, but how it translates is you want to be a big person, so big that you could float a ship inside your belly. Now that may not be obvious what that means, but it means that it's using the idea of being huge physically as a metaphor for being huge in character, from being such a giant creature that you could float a giant ship inside your belly. That's an analogy to having a character that's so big that you can contain all kinds of stuff and not be bothered by it. You're bigger than that. We have this kind of phrase in our own language too. Somebody gets real petty. Chinese call them shaoren. It means like a little person, a little human, like you're not in size but in character. And so what you want to be is the opposite of the shaoren. You want to be so big that you could float a boat in your belly. And this is a sign of great refinement, and others will follow you like the North Star. All right, here's another passage, 2.7. So Book 2, paragraph 7. Ziyou asked about filiality. So again, about filial or family devotion. The master said, what is meant by filiality today is nothing but being able to take care of your parents. But even hounds and horses can require care. Without respectful vigilance, what is the difference? And here he seems to be saying, you must take care of your parents, but you must also take care of other family members too. And this is a crucial way of being a good person. I introduced this idea of shao as filial. This is a different shao from small. And I think there's one more passage to look at for us here because we're running out of time. I want to draw the discussion here to a close, but there's a wonderful passage here in a much later section of the Analects, in particular in Book 13. So I'm at 13, Book 13, paragraph 18. And here the passage reads, basically what's happened is Confucius has gone to an outlying region where there's a fairly powerful, he's not an emperor, but he's a fairly powerful prince there, and his name is the Lord of Shi, or the Duke of Shi. And so the Lord of Shi wants to impress Confucius. This guy's come, he knows Confucius has kind of a good reputation. He wants to show how upright and righteous they are in that region and how his people are really morally upright. So he says to Confucius, the Lord of Shi instructed Confucius, saying, quote, "There is an upright man in my district. His father stole a sheep, and this man testified against his own father." That's how upright and moral he is. That's how upright and moral we are here. And Confucius says, quote, "The upright men in my district are different. The fathers cover up for the sons, and the sons cover up for their fathers. There is uprightness in this." So this is kind of amazing. He's saying, oh, you know, you guys are so upright that fathers will testify against, sons will testify against their fathers and vice versa. But where I come from, we shield, the family shields each other. That's what we think of as being ethically upright. And this is really important because it shows you the importance of loyalty in Confucian ethics. And this is hard to square with some of the egalitarian notions of fairness that we're more used to in the West, because we're supposed to treat everybody equally according to the ethical sort of paradigms that we have. Whereas Confucius is saying, no, you privilege your family. You might even protect them in the face of the law, of what's right and wrong in terms of the law. So this is an important feature of Confucian ethics, which I will call sort of the virtues of loyalty. All right, I think that's really those are the main ideas in Confucianism. We could unpack this further, but I think you've got the sort of fundamentals down, the roots, as it were, of Kongtse's philosophy. And what happened subsequent to this was Confucianism ended up it fell in and out of favor, and there were Neo-Confucian movements, and then Buddhism came into China about 1,000 years later, and then Confucianism has always vied with other traditions in China, including Buddhism and Taoism. By the time you got up to the 19th century, Confucianism was the sort of defining philosophy for becoming a civil servant. You had to take the 8-legged exam, which was very difficult kind of exam. I suppose like maybe the descendant of this is the Gaokao, which is a very extreme exam system in China today. And so Confucianism was a sort of dominant philosophy of secular life in China. Then in the 20th century, the communist movements of Chairman Mao came to see Confucianism as the sort of the philosophy of the bourgeoisie and of the philosophy of the ruling class. So during the Great Leap Forward, but particularly during the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, Confucianism was targeted as the enemy and was banned and was removed from the schools, and it was not sort of learned as part of Chinese culture because modernization, according to Mao, sort of had to break these loyalistic tendencies within Confucianism. Now, this didn't work, and starting in the 70s, we had the sort of dismantling of official communist ideologies like Maoism, and the opening up of the free markets. But even today, the communist leaders like Xi Jinping and before him Hu Jintao celebrate now and reclaim their Confucian heritage. So it's very common now to see Confucian study and Confucian institutes in China and abroad. And so it's respectable again to study and to cherish Confucianism in Chinese culture. All right. That will close my comments. Thank you.